Hi, I'm Dr. William Starsiak. There are so many YouTube videos out there with amazing information, and they tell you exactly what you need to do in really all areas of your life. We've never lived in a time where information was more accessible, but our health is still pretty dismal in the United States if you look at the averages. So what's going on there? That's why in this video, as I was contemplating what I wanted to share, I decided I didn't want to go after just more information of what you should do, because it seems that one of the biggest challenges for us is not the knowing what we should do, right? It's the doing of what we should do. Sometimes just the fact that we know something and we don't do it, it becomes a form of self-torture where we just hold that over ourselves that, hey, I know I should be doing this, but I'm not. And we still do what we shouldn't do, but we just add that extra voice in our head that is a little self-critical. And so one thing you'll find is some people even saying to try to get rid of that voice, to like, oh, don't be ashamed of doing the thing you know you shouldn't do. Don't feel like it's wrong. And so they create these different systems to try to get rid of guilt or shame. If we have a pretty good understanding of the world and an understanding of where we fit in it and what's important and our value system is relatively well aligned, then guilt and shame are actually wholesome states. They arise when we don't demonstrate what's important to us through our actions, right? If our actions are demonstrating that something else is important to us other than what we say is important, what we say to ourselves and what we say to other people, well, then of course we're going to feel ashamed because there's a lack of integrity. We're not living up to the expectations we've given other people or we've given ourselves. So while shame and guilt don't feel good, they are wholesome, motivating states if we respond to them appropriately. Actually, when we feel that, don't try to get away from it. Don't blame the shame and the guilt. Those are actually our friends. They're the ones that are going to help take us to where we want to go. And that may not be a real popular opinion out there, but it's an ancient one too. This idea shows up in the Yogacara school of Buddhism, the consciousness-only school of Buddhism, where they list all of the different wholesome states. And shame and guilt are actually amongst those wholesome states. So now the next thing is we really do need mindfulness. If we're going to make any change, we need to be mindful. Just like if we're going to do anything, right? If we're going to have a war, we need intelligence, right? We need to be mindful of what's going on. If we're going to build a garden, well, we got to understand where we're putting that garden, how much sun it's getting, what sort of drainage it has, what sort of soil it has. If we're digging, are there any lines we might break? So mindfulness is very important. And why this is important is because for most of us, if we don't have experience with meditation and developing mindfulness, we have these conceptions about how our mind works that doesn't actually match how it works. We think like, oh, I'm the decider, I'm the ultimate one that makes the decision, and my mind is just sort of a uniform thing. But when you look at it closely, you can see that there are competing interests within your mind, right? There's this desire for stimulus, for stimulation, for entertainment generally. And our level of expectations for that stimulation is quite high compared to someone living in America 100 years ago, right? We've really been desensitized. And the same is very true with food. Our expectation for stimulation, entertainment from food is quite high because of these engineered, preserved food products that are really the easiest to get a hold of and the cheapest. So we're living in a system that would have us not do the healthiest thing. The easiest thing to do is not the healthiest thing, right? the healthiest thing has become more difficult to do just because of the system that we live in. And so that's an aspect that I want to bring to the forefront because it also helps us to have compassion for ourselves. While I said guilt and shame are beneficial, but this lack of self-compassion is not. Beating ourselves up, using our guilt and shame to beat ourselves down into the ground so that we feel sort of despair and hopelessness, that's no good. What we got to acknowledge is that we're living in a context that has a certain current. So it's reasonable if we find ourselves practicing habits that are not ideal, because that is sort of the culture that we live in. However, once we notice that, we don't have to just go with the current. We actually do have the ability to choose. Once we're mindful of the different motivations that are within our mind. So one of these motivations being like this expectation for stimulation. That's one thing. Another one is this sort of group think. When we get together with other people, what is everybody doing? And if everybody's doing one thing, well, it's very hard to not do that. And sometimes that stops us from ever moving forward. It stops us from ever initiating that first step because we think like, okay, well, what are my friends going to think? What's my family going to think? Yeah, I want to stop eating meat, but what's my family going to think? Or I want to start doing this sort of, I want to start meditating, but hey, my brothers or my sisters are going to make fun of me. So that's another example of where mindfulness comes in. In this process of going from knowing to doing, we need to become mindful. We need to be aware of what's unfolding in our inner world, how we think about things and how we feel about things. Because when we first create that idea of some goal, and it could be in any dimension of our life and health. So like a goal of, all right, I want to begin meditation. And if we don't go into action on that, if we're stopped, well, then we need to be able to see why. We need to be able to look at the different dynamics and say, okay, I have this motivation, I have this will to move forward in this area, but I'm getting stopped. And so we got to flesh that thing out. And this is a good point to distinguish these different ways of being that people have. And we could kind of loosely class them into optimism and pessimism. So a pessimistic view may say that, oh, there is some sort of blockage to my forward motion. This is never going to work. See this, there's this problem, and there's this problem. There's going to be that problem. There's going to be that problem. It's better to just not do this because it's just going to be a bunch of problems. So that's pretty pessimistic, and that's going to tend to keep us stuck. And then there's the other end of that, which is optimism, which is saying that like, oh, okay, yeah, it's all going to work out. It's all going to be fine. And a certain amount of optimism is really good because it helps us find a way forward. But if we're too optimistic, we may not really understand how tough making a change may be, especially if it comes to eating or comes to exercise. We can run into a lot of resistance. So we may not be realistic about modeling the difficulty of something. And so we may be very willing to start a process and get through maybe the first couple obstacles. But then when we get into the maintenance, excessive optimism may be an issue because there may be some work in that maintenance period until things become automatic in a certain sense, where we develop a new habit, we develop a new preference. But until we get over that hump, then there can be some difficulty. So the ideal balance would be this way between excessive optimism or excessive pessimism, where we're looking for the way forward. Instead of looking for why we should get stopped, we can look for the way forward. Problem solving, basically. So if we were to, like an example, let's say someone wants to start a meditation practice and they say, well, I'm so busy, I don't have any time for meditation at all. Quick aside, the reason that someone presents for not moving forward to themselves or to other people frequently is not the actual reason for not moving forward. There is a deeper reason for not moving forward, and a sort of mask reason is given in its place. But let's say, we can just start with interacting with the presented reasons for not moving forward. And a reason like this does reveal that it's probably not the actual reason. Like, I don't have enough time. When you have these reasons that are pretty flimsy, like you look at them and you say like, okay, well, there's plenty of people who find time to meditate, and there are people doing all sorts of different things. So why would one person be so convinced that they absolutely have no time? Right? It's just that it says that there's something else going on behind the scenes other than just time. It's sort of like I need a convenient excuse to let myself off the hook, is what that sort of reason says to me. Because we can very easily say, okay, we'll start with 1 minute. Start with 1 minute. And, if someone has resistance to a solution like that, where they're saying, oh, yeah, well, blah, blah, blah. Like there could be any sort of reason, or it may even be a feeling of like, well, it's not worth it. If I don't do 30 minutes, it's not worth it to just do 1 minute. That's a common thing as well. Like if it's only worth it if I hit this threshold of time, or if I hit this goal, but there's no way I can hit that goal because I don't have time to do it. So I'm just not going to do it at all, and I'm just going to kind of bemoan the absence of whatever the achievement of that goal would be. Right? That is just a perfect scenario where someone just locks themselves in. They'll say, I want this, and then they'll create this scenario where they can't have it, but they'll put themselves in a situation to talk with someone who wants to help them get what they want, a friend or a coach or whatever, but then they want to just circle around all the reasons they can't find a way forward. So here, this is circling back to this principle of being committed to finding a way forward. And then also taking an incremental process if necessary, right? If you're going to do something and you know yourself and you're like, hey, I can go all in and I'm going to stick with it, I'm going to carry it through, then go all in. But if you're in this space where you're having trouble making a change, then incremental change is generally the best way to go. Right? You're probably not going to be hanging around for this video this long if you're really good at finding your way forward. This is for those of us that get stuck on things. So picking the smallest commitment, or rather not the smallest, picking the biggest commitment that you know will be non-negotiable. Right? So if it's exercise, okay, I know that every day I can do 4 push-ups, I can do 8 air squats, and I can do 1 pull-up. Like something like that, picking something that you know, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to give my excuse. There's no way that I'm ever going to be able to give an excuse to not do this. That's a really good place to start. I like to think of this as the sand grain that gets inside the clam. You get that sand grain of a commitment. That's really like a very important first step. Some sort of meaningful commitment. Not something that's so overwhelming that you're never going to get started. Something that's underwhelming that you're going to get started with and you're going to stick to it. Because that is a significant step. Recognizing that making that commitment and keeping that commitment is a significant step. And then it has a snowball effect, or like that grain of sand in the pearl effect, where once you start with it, you're doing those 4 push-ups, those 8 air squats, and the 1 pull-up a day, well, you're going to start to feel like, I'd like to do a little bit more. It feels good once you're into it, and then you'll gradually want to do a little bit more. So then it just becomes about managing the unfolding of that process. Because we want to achieve a natural ignition where motivation becomes automatic. So we're no longer grinding from an intellectual goal, but we begin to feel the juice that comes back, the reward. And this again is why mindfulness becomes important. Because if you start doing those few push-ups and those air squats and that pull-up, and you feel how your body feels, you notice that energy, Now you're making a connection in your brain where you're like, oh yeah, this was easy. I could do this and I felt better from doing it. It's free. I don't have to drive anywhere. I don't have to do anything. Like you can take all those barriers away when you start a goal. Make it really simple, make it really immediate, and then begin to build that positive feedback through mindfulness. And then also you build up the other type of feedback from, okay, what happens if you don't fulfill on it? How does that feel? Like, do you want that guilt? Do you want that shame? Do you want the lower energy level? If you're not exercising, or the lack of clarity in the mind if you're not meditating, or the sluggishness if you're not taking care of your nutrition and you're using food as entertainment instead of as nutrition. And so you can both see the benefits of the positive action, be mindful of that, the detriments of the negative action, you're mindful of that, and then what begins to happen is you transform your preference. Your preference is related to your sense of how much does this activity serve myself. And you may have a strong preference towards an activity that really doesn't serve you, but you're confused. Like we get confused, we are kind of ignorant in some ways. We focus on a narrow subsection of our experience. So I eat the cake and I feel good. We don't think about, okay, the blood sugar spike, if I do it recurrently, I'm going to gain weight. It's going to, if I have a higher blood sugar over time, it's going to damage my arteries, and then I'm going to lose all sort of function. So we will narrow our focus. That's why mindfulness is a remedy, because we basically say, all right, I'm not narrowing my focus at all. My focus is totally open. Everything connected with this behavior is going to be taken into account. It's going to be appreciated. It doesn't necessarily have to be analyzed intellectually, but just noticed. Oh, I did this thing and I felt better. Oh, I did this thing and I felt worse, and it took a while until I got back to feeling okay again. Because that process of using mindfulness to change preferences helps us transform it from a grind into a natural expression, which is the goal. We want to establish ourselves in our ideal, healthy lifestyle as a natural expression, because we can't grind every day for the rest of our lives. So we have to allow ourselves to be educated by witnessing the consequence of our actions. So if you can achieve this ignition by first, you identify an area that you have motivation to make a change in, you commit to something that's non-negotiable, that's a small enough commitment that you're going to be able to keep it, and then you pay attention to the benefits that come from keeping it, and you pay attention to what happens when you don't keep it. You gradually transform that preference, and you begin to get an ignition for that activity where you're getting positive feedback for doing it, so then you're going to want to invest in it more. And then you invest in it more gradually. Right? Don't over-invest in it too soon, because what could happen is you could hit a big spike in activity, and then you're like, oh, I can't maintain this, and you're going to then drop off, and then you're going to feel really bad about it, and you might use it as a reason to not do it again. So you want to nurture that ignition, nurture that growing fire by gradually increasing the commitment. So the motivation to increase the commitment should be more than the amount that you increase the commitment. So that's another key here, that as you feel that desire to increase it, leave some pressure where you want to do even more. Leave that there. You want to always kind of keep that drive so that you're not getting yourself stuck in a space where every day you're like, oh God, why did I do this? And then don't get too ambitious, right? Once you've done good enough, recognize that. It's very important that we recognize once we've achieved good enough, because perfect can become the enemy of good enough. We can be doing something regularly for a long period of time. We can build up to a certain level, but we can, without noticing it, go past where our balance point is, and we can overcommit. It can begin to feel a drag, but we can feel like, no, we have to keep our word. We have to stick with this until eventually we just give it up altogether. So if you do find that you overshoot, you can always back off and really aim for initially, what's good enough? And if you want to then become really exceptional at something, well, the motivation is going to bring you there. You're not going to find yourself running into fatigue over it. You may burn yourself out and then need to rest, but that motivation is going to be right back there again because you just really are naturally drawn to it. There's something about that particular aspect that really calls your energy forth and is not difficult. So we want to cultivate that sort of motivation, and we can conceptualize it like a fire. That initial motivation is like, okay, yeah, I want to do this. I see the possibility. I can look in the future and imagine myself as the person who's doing this, and I can imagine having the benefits that come from this sort of commitment, and let me take that first step. We have all of these different sayings that we're all familiar with, and one of them that fits this perfectly that you've probably heard before is a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So if we're trying to think of the whole 1,000 miles, we may never take that first step. So that's what's very important. Take that first step and then gradually expand the commitment until we achieve what's good enough for us. We feel like this, this is good. If I'm jogging, it doesn't have to be jogging, it could be swimming, it could be walking, it could be weightlifting, whatever, 3 times a week, and I'm spending an hour at that activity 3 times a week, well, the fact that I got to that point and that I'm committed to that is fantastic. It's perfect for me. I feel great about that. Yeah, maybe there's other people I know who are doing more. Maybe there'd be some additional benefit if I do more. But for most of us, we don't need to totally maximize, say, the exercise domain, because our work, what's most important to us, doesn't depend upon us being, maximized in that domain. Loving our family, being present for our family doesn't depend upon that. There's a point where a commitment can begin to detract from the things which are most important to us. So we don't want to become absolutist, dogmatic, perfectionists about this. We want to acknowledge what is this serving? If I'm trying to have better health, what am I trying to have better health for? I want to be around long enough to see my grandchildren as they grow up. I want to be able to still be walking in my 80s and my 90s. Or, I want to have maybe it is something to do with work. Maybe my work, I need to be very vigilant. I need to be focused and have fine attention to detail. So that may be a reason to practice meditation. But I don't need to then spend 6 hours a day and spend no time with my family because I'm doing that. So it's all about balance. And this was brought out really well in Buddhism, the middle way, the way between extremes. Later, the Greeks talked about this, and the Greeks were influenced by Buddhist thought. There was even a Bactrian king that had the Buddha on some of their coin pieces. But the Greeks talk about the golden mean, the golden ratio. We see this ratio in our bodies and in other living things, but they would use this idea to say each individual has their particular balance in their different domains of life. So, how physical of a being are they based on their particular balance? Now we may say, their genetics, or what's their sort of natural sexual expression or intellectual involvement. And we ideally move towards that in all the domains in our life. And if we think about it a little philosophically, we could consider, what is it that would have us not move towards that? So if we have this balance, we have this expression that's best for us, what is it that keeps us from doing that? And it's really desire and attachment. We have some sort of experience where there's a pleasant sensation, and then we want to keep having that. And so then we ignore the wisdom that's present in our body. We ignore that feedback because we're so compelled by this pleasant experience. And this is just the basic pattern for any sort of problematic habit. So you could say, that's the root of, say, sexual addiction, where people ruin relationships because of just unchecked desire that's based on this sort of lack of wisdom. or any addictive process, whether it be food or cigarettes or kind of illegal drugs. It's seeking for that same pleasurable sensation. And that kind of is like that perfect is the enemy of good enough. You know, if we feel good, we feel healthy, we feel normal, but we want to feel like really good, well, okay, that sort of can lead to that process of using drugs to try to feel really good. And you know, there's therapeutic roles for different substances that are currently illegal, like psilocybin or MDMA. There's therapeutic aspects, so it's not to say that there's no potential positive usage or medicinal usage of those things, but I think we can all agree that an addicted state where someone is overly reliant upon those things and running to them again and quick as they can, that's obviously problematic. But the same pattern that underlies that addictive process, it really underlies anything that we do that takes us away from our balance, from our natural expression, our inherent like golden mean. Maybe it's just scrolling on the phone. We have some extra time and, well, we could just relax, right? We could notice our breathing, or we could take the opportunity to practice something that is important to us. But how many of us sink hours into scrolling and not really get much out of it? You know, we may get some information, but do we act on that information? And that's what this whole video is about, really, is that we are collecting so much information, but it's hard to actually act on it. And it's probably best in the beginning to not do too many things, but to maybe focus on one at a time until they become natural. But so we identify an area, and then we become mindful about the area, right? We initially don't have to make a knee-jerk change right away. First, we can just witness, what are we doing in that area? What choices are we making? When the time comes to make the choice, what choice are we making? And what's the conversation and the feelings that we have when we make that choice? That's going to begin to help us to understand why things are the way they are. We're not going to be very good at creating something new if we don't first understand why things are the way they are. I first heard this concept described really well by a Zen Roshi at Rochester Zen Center, Roshi Bodhin Kolhid. And this is exactly how he described it when someone begins a Zen practice. We may have an idea of where we want to be, but if we begin by denying where we are, then we're immediately stuck, right? But if we start with witnessing where we are in a certain dynamic. So when it's Zen, it's sort of like, what happens when I sit down? And for most people, they start with being aware of their breathing. It's like, okay, what happens? What's the quality of my mind? And we can begin to notice it. And then as we notice it, we can begin to retrain it. But the beginning is opening up to what is. So if it's, say, something to do with food, okay, 9 o'clock rolls around, I get a feeling, and then that feeling I interpret as, ooh, I'm hungry, and it would be really nice. I know it would feel really good if I ate this thing. That can happen like that process, that feeling and that thought and the conclusion, and then we can go to actually the action before we realize that the domino of feeling fell, and then we're in front of the freezer with the ice cream before we really come to. It's kind of like if we sit down to meditate and we want to be aware of our breathing, and then a couple moments later, we're distracted and we don't realize it for a couple minutes, where we've been thinking about whatever. Maybe we're thinking about eating ice cream. And then all of a sudden we realize it and we have a choice. So that's the only time we can really make our choice. Like once we realize that we're not following our commitment. And we have to be mindful in that moment in order to make the choice. Otherwise, we just go with whatever our habit pattern is. But we're self-compassionate enough to understand that those distractions will happen. Like in meditation, we will be distracted. And the same thing is true in any domain. If we have a commitment, we will kind of automatically go with our old habit pattern. So we don't need to beat ourselves up for that happening. We just need to notice, and then once we realize and we have the opportunity to make a choice, in the beginning, we need to understand what is our motivation for making the choice that we're making. A lot of the times, people will not practice mindfulness if they think they have to make the right choice, the choice they know that's right. So what I recommend is to take away that barrier of beginning. Is in this first phase, you're not having to change anything. All you're doing is being aware. So if you're there at the fridge and you notice, oh gosh, I'm doing this, like here, this is the time that is giving me the result that I don't want. I'm in it. I'm now. It's the time I can choose. And gosh, I still really want to eat that ice cream. Everything in me, I still want to, I'm going to eat it. So if you just use that time for information gathering, like being a spy in enemy lines, like, okay, yeah, I'm going to go along with this thing, but I'm going to witness what happens. I'm going to witness, okay, when I actually eat this ice cream, is the promise that's in my mind fulfilled? Like, do I really get what I think I'm going to get? And then, after the ice cream's done, all right, am I satisfied? Do I still want more? How do I feel physically? How do I feel about myself? Do I feel a little ashamed that I did this and I didn't really get what I thought I would get? Because that becomes the fuel for the changing of the preference. Like if you're already like, no, I can't change this yet, well, become mindful. And the mindfulness could begin to change the preference for you. And then gradually, after you do that, at some point you could say, okay, I've been mindful of this process 5 times now. This is my 6th time. And each of the previous times, I've done the thing that is giving me the result that I don't want. I know what that's like. I know exactly what it's like, and I want to try something different. So then you could use that as your sort of your fulcrum to get some leverage to then make a different choice. And then when you make that different choice, you pay attention to how you feel, like what happens. And you gradually try to make that better choice more and more. And then the more you make that better choice, the more you accumulate the benefits of the better choice. Because we really are just an accumulation of the consequences of our actions, our physical bodies. Like look at someone's face, right? If they've been angry a bunch of their life, well, they look angry in their face. Their wrinkles etch in that way. If they've been happy, well, they got these big old cheek muscles and they got these wrinkles around their eyes that make them look happy. So that should be pretty apparent, Yeah, if you work out a lot, well, your body's going to show it. If you eat a lot, well, your body's going to show it. Our physical bodies, also our emotions and our mentality, they're an accumulation of the choices that we've made. There's also things that happen to us that aren't really choices. So then it's about how do we respond to them. There's obviously things that are very hard that can happen to people. And, so it's those things we need to also have patience and compassion for. So maybe, for instance, with a cigarette, like a nicotine addiction, someone wants to quit, but it's very difficult. And, there's different classes of difficult when it comes to nicotine addiction. So one would be, hey, this guy started smoking when he's 21. He's been smoking for 5 years. That's one thing. This other guy, well, his mom was smoking when he was in utero. And then she was smoking when he was being breastfed. And she would smoke when he was in the car. So smoking, nicotine, is tied in with the nurturance of a mother. All right, well, that is a totally different scenario, right? And so you wouldn't expect that person would have the same ease of changing as the other person who had just been smoking for like 5 years after they were, pretty much close to a fully formed adult. So the mindfulness aspect, though, would reveal that gradually. So as we look into the feeling that we have that is part of the motivation for the action that's not good for us, that feeling can begin to tell us about our relationship with that behavior and the feeling we get if we decide not to do it. Like if you're at an office party and there's cake and you don't eat that cake, look at how people look at you or talk to you. It's kind of like, are you okay? Like, why, why are you eating this cake? Like, what's wrong? Or like you need some sort of explanation, and that maybe you're denying yourself some sort of emotional comfort in some way or something, right? For most people, especially in the United States, food, especially dessert, has been conflated with other stuff. For a lot of people, it's reward or punishment. So if you let yourself have it, that means you're good. You've been doing a good job. Just like your parents would say, okay, you don't get dessert, you were being bad. And that carries through to our adult life. Just, probably most of us have had that sort of experience where we felt that people have that sense around someone not eating cake in a setting where there's cake. It's changing more and more now. I think there's like awareness of the gluten sensitivity stuff, and there's more digestive issues, probably because of our lifestyle and all the weird stuff, all the weird chemicals in just in the stream of things that we come in contact with throughout our day. So as more people have been affected by that, there's a greater sensitivity for dietary changes. So it's getting easier and easier, but still we can see that we have these other emotional dynamics that are tied into that relationship with food. So being mindful of those feelings will help us gradually unwind that process where we can use insight. We can say, okay, well, yeah, I feel like if I don't eat this cookie, I'm, on some level, I feel like I'm punishing myself, but like that really doesn't make sense. When I'm thinking about it, I feel like it would be punishment to eat this cookie because it's just too much sugar. There's nothing in it that my body really needs. It's going to be like a lightning flash with respect to the satisfaction that I get from it. And then after, all I'm going to have is the consequence. The benefit is gone in a second, and the consequence persists, especially if it's something that someone has become discouraged about, an inability to change. Then the emotional consequence persists, because being disempowered emotionally is no good for us. To feel like we have this goal, we want to do this thing, but we can't trust ourselves to achieve it, like that's depressing in a certain sense. So if we're serious people, like if we're serious about what we say is important to us, then we need to act on that. Because otherwise, we can't respect ourselves. If we can see that, hey, this is something I could physically do. I could make this choice. It is possible, but I don't. Even though it's important to me, I don't. It's like I said, it's depressing. It's going to lessen our own self-confidence, how we project ourselves into the world, and then it's going to have different consequences. If we don't keep our word and we don't align our actions with what's important to us, how would we then expect other people to relate to us? Yeah, we have the initial motivation, then the development of mindfulness, and the next step is the initiation of a change that's non-negotiable. I understand myself well enough. I understand my motivations well enough. This commitment I will be able to maintain. It does not challenge my core attachments enough that I'm going to give it up, right? So example would be like if you love ice cream, you want to not eat ice cream all the time. Well, if you said, okay, I'm going to not eat ice cream, I'm going to go from eating it every day to eating it one day. That's a big jump. If you know you can do it, cool, but if it's that big of a problem for you, you've been struggling with it, the chances are, statistically, you may not be able to. So you may start with something different. You may start with, okay, first I'm mindful, and I'm going to be aware of how much am I eating. And I get my average. So my average is every day I'm eating whatever, this many ounces of ice cream. And so I've got the lay of the land. Now I know that if I take away too much, I'm going to notice, I'm not going to like it, I might revolt. So I need to take away enough that's meaningful to me, but that's not going to throw me off. That's not going to keep me from moving forward. So you take away whatever, a fourth of the total amount that you're eating. So every day, instead of eating 16 ounces of ice cream, and eating 12 ounces of ice cream. And then do that until it becomes normal, right? You just let that normalize into where you no longer think about it. It's no longer a hassle. And then you can take the next step. You can say, okay, really I could drop this down to 6. And it can show up in different ways. The way you can move forward, you can switch it up, because it could, instead of being dropping it down, it could be, okay, I'm not eating it as many days. I'm eating just as much on those days, but I'm not eating it 7 days a week. I'm eating it 6 days a week. And so that's one thing. You can take something away, but you can also introduce something else. So what am I doing because I'm not eating ice cream? Like, what does that open up? Gradually, like, okay, so the day where I'm not eating ice cream, that day I would have spent, 30 minutes sitting there eating ice cream. Instead, I'm going to pow. What is it? What is it that fulfills on something that's important? So you recognize the motivation. You begin to develop mindfulness around the current dynamic of how things are, so you have enough information to be able to create a non-negotiable commitment that you keep, and then that begins to grow naturally. You don't try to overextend yourself too quickly. You try to keep more motivation. You want to have the motivation every time you increase the change. You want to have it be less than the motivation you have. So if your motivation is, yeah, man, I really feel like, I could go down to just eating ice cream 1 day a week. Well, okay, maybe you're at 4 days a week, and instead of going all the way, okay, maybe you do 2 days a week. So you really feel like, I could do it, but you give yourself a little bit more. You kind of make it a little easier on yourself because of taking the long view. We're not taking a short view when we're looking for a lifestyle change. The long view gives you an advantage because now you're saying that, okay, there could be some turbulence in the middle, but ultimately here's where I'm going, and I don't have too much pressure, so I can do this. I can succeed. I'm not going to put myself in a position where I'm going to fail. I'm going to make it easy for myself to succeed, and I'm going to be patient, and I'm going to be self-compassionate, and I'm going to recognize, I'm going to be sincere. This is really my goal, and I got to work with these different motivations inside my mind in order to achieve this goal. There's motivations for, like I said, entertainment. That's one motivation. Or there's stress, using it for stress management sometimes. Some big stressful event happens, and it throws us sideways. So we have to gradually incorporate that with our mindfulness of recognizing, how does a stressful event throw me sideways? And how can I recover from that? How can I create space for that and fit this into this overall big process? And so that's that growing of the commitment and maintaining of the commitment, and then recognizing once we've achieved good enough. And then whenever we fall off, we just come right back to it. We pick it right back up in the process wherever is natural for us. Like if you fell off weightlifting for a year, well, you're not going to pick back up the same weight. You're going to have to start over, but you'll accelerate faster. Right? The same is true with any sort of commitment. If you made a bunch of progress and then you gave up or you got distracted, when you come back to it, well, depending on how long you're away, you may have to start over, but you'll be able to get back to where you were faster. And when you look at something like quitting cigarettes, the research shows that every additional attempt produces more people who are able to quit. The success rate is higher with every additional attempt because there's a certain percentage of people who just don't try again. So being persistent, that's the other attribute. Not planning to give up on your commitment, but recognizing that you're human and that that's likely to happen, having a big enough view, creating enough space in your plan to allow for that possibility, and then just planning to recommit when that happens. Right? None of us are perfect. If we were perfect, we wouldn't be dealing with difficulties in making changes. And if we're dealing with those difficulties, it's likely that, we'll fall off at some point. And that's fine. We don't plan for it. We don't intend it, rather. But we're ready for it if it does happen. As soon as we notice we have, we can just recommit to it. Ideally, we don't use the aversion to shame and guilt to keep us from working towards achieving our natural balance. Right? There's a natural balance for exercise. There's a natural balance for our nutritional intake, for our social interactions, for our intellectual engagement. And when we don't meet that, we have consequences. So we're not trying to create something unusual or artificial. We're trying to get the unusual and the artificial out of the way. What we begin to notice is that as that commitment grows, and once we reach the balance, that sort of like good enough balance, that then other areas are easier. You know, if we get our relationship with food really good, well, generally we feel good and it's easier to exercise. Or if we're exercising, it's a little bit easier to get our food relationship right because then we have good energy. You know, we have a way to deal with stress. And so we don't necessarily have to use food as the way to deal with stress. And so all of these different aspects of our health reinforce the other. So when we make an improvement in one, then we make an improvement in all the others to a certain extent. And the reward of achieving the goal is the reward, right? So if we have a goal of like, okay, I want to quit nicotine, right? After we quit nicotine, we don't reward ourselves with nicotine. You know, we reward ourselves with being free from it, from not having to have it. So if we're looking to get a better relationship with food and we've achieved a milestone, well, we don't then reward ourselves with the food that we know isn't good for us, that's stopped. Is that ideally our preferences change so that the unhealthy, problematic stuff no longer has an appeal. So we're not exercising discipline. So then when we get to the point where we could have a reward, that the idea of what sort of food we would use as a reward ideally would be different. So instead of like a preserved processed cake, maybe it's something that only has raw sugar in it. And instead of refined flour, maybe it's like it's like coconut and almond flour or something like that, where you have it's fine to have sweets. It's just what's the nature of the sweet and how much of it is there. So like raw sweeteners are obviously better than refined. You have a lower glycemic index. By taking molasses out of sugar and making it white, it makes the glycemic index higher. If you just leave the molasses in the sugar, well, it takes longer for that sugar to absorb, and there's actually minerals that go along with it. So there's some benefit. Like if you look in Ayurvedic medicine, they recognize that there's a value to raw sugar. It's actually considered to be a potentially medicinal substance, particularly for certain types of constitutions. Okay, a key I haven't talked about yet for making these changes is having someone that you entrust with your goal. Someone in your life that you're going to see regularly that you feel comfortable in trusting them with your goal. You tell yourself, so you have yourself to be accountable to, but if you tell someone else that cares about you, that you respect, and you ask them to hold you accountable, well, now you've got another motivation. It's not just your own drive. You also then can tie it in with the communal motivation and the desire to look good, right? If we can harness that ability to a certain extent, most of us have it. Like we don't want to look bad in front of other people. So if we tell someone this is our goal, then when we're in the moment to make the choice, there's a good chance we're going to think about having to tell the person if we make the wrong choice, or if we're repeatedly making the wrong choice, having to acknowledge that. But use this wisely, because this, you pick the wrong person and this can create a relationship issue or conflict, or if you're not good at receiving feedback, that could also create a problem. And this is why I bring it out at the later point in the video, is because in some ways it's potentially problematic if you don't do it really well. So the person that you choose has to be someone that you really trust, that you're comfortable giving you feedback and motivating you. And another element would be creating something to help us remember. Now, this could be a calendar note. If you always look at your calendar, okay, every Wednesday I see I'm going to the gym, or, I planned out my meals. And so I'm seeing this is what I'm doing all these different days, or I'm scheduling time with my family. in the beginning, we need something extra to keep this alive for us. So, the person that we have as our accountability person, they may not be around us every day. So we need something that's also there every day. Sometimes people will put an image on their mirror. They'll tape something up that reminds them of their commitment. What's important is that it feeds our motivation, that it's an encouragement. It's something to keep alive the commitment in a way that is inspiring, to kind of refresh and remind us of that original seed of motivation. Because as I said at the beginning, it's like we're feeding a fire, and we want that fire to grow. So whatever it is that we're looking to invite into our life, we're looking to have more of, or whatever it is we're looking to have less of, the reason behind that. Like what's really the thing that gets us like to be like, yeah, I'm going to do it. So we want to have something that reminds us of that every day. It can be visual, it can be auditory, whatever it is. And ideally, multiple reminders of that. And we have to be sensitive to the quality of those reminders, because it can get to a point where we just ignore them. Like probably some people are part of email lists or text lists where someone's doing something over and over and you just ignore it. You just don't even listen to it because it's obnoxious in a certain way. So, or it's not necessarily obnoxious, but it's just not seen as valuable. It's not inspiring. It's not engaging. So when you're using this aspect, it's important that you keep it inspiring, you keep it engaging, you refresh it. So if it's an image on your mirror, well, maybe you change that image up every once in a while. Or if it's a phrase, maybe you change that phrase up. You look at it from another angle. Whenever we're making these changes, it's good to keep things fresh, to do things in different ways so we don't become bored. Like if we're, say it's working out. I a little while ago was having trouble working out regularly, so I made this commitment that I was going to pick 3 exercises, and on day 1, I did 1 rep of each exercise. Just a single repetition, a single set. And then on day 2, I did 2. And I did that for 2 days, and I did 3 for 3 days, and 4 for 4 days. And I got all the way up to where I was doing like 6 exercises, and I was doing 3 sets of each exercise, like rep 12, 10, 8. And it got to the point where it was just getting to be burdensome. And then I just started, going to the gym and doing the thing I'd done in the past. So I switched it up. Like I used one technique, kind of like a boat, to get across a river. And then I had already invested the time and I had it set aside and I was doing it regularly. And so cool. All right, now I can switch it over to this. I'd done that in the past with running. I got up to running a half marathon, and then I took all that discipline and I put it into weightlifting. So that's another way. Once we have dedicated the time, the space, the energy to a certain thing, we can transform how that looks in order to maintain the commitment to it. Because if we keep it too rote, if we keep it too repetitive, then it becomes hard to engage. We sort of go through the motions. And if we're going through the motions, it's only a matter of time until we give up on it. Or it's as if we've given up on it because we become like a zombie doing it. So we need to continually be mindful, right? In every aspect of this process, we continually are mindful so that we can adapt to the changing dynamic within us. We can match those sort of needs within us in an intelligent way. So we switch up the way that we're committed to something to keep it fresh. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that you found it informative and useful, that you'll be able to take it and apply it to your life. If you do, please put it in the comments, or even if you haven't applied it yet, but you plan to, put it in the comments. If you have questions about anything I said, or you think something doesn't make sense, also put it in the comments. Let's have a conversation. And if there's something else you want to hear me talk about, same sort of thing, put it in the comments. And be sure to like this video and subscribe and turn on the alarm button so you'll get notifications when I do more.